Hello, world and universe. Welcome to the Trevor Donald Experience. Manifest your truth. And I have a story for you called A Forgotten History of How the U.S. Government Segregated America During the Depression of the 1930s. This story has everything to do with a real estate term called redlining. This story has everything to do with some of our governmental agencies like the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, the VA, Veterans Administration mortgages, where military people can get their first-time home buyers loans and mortgages from the VA. All of this is coming from our federal government, and this story has everything to do with suburban white flight. Like Bob Marley wrote in his song Exodus, the movement of Ja people, and for white America in the 1930s, it was called white suburban sprawl flight from the inner cities of America. You take St. Louis, for example. Monday through Friday around 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., our highways going to South County, Highway 55 to Fenton and Festus. You got Highway 30, Gravois, going to Gravois Bluffs. Highway 44 going to Valley Park, Eureka. Highway 40 going to Ladue, Chesterfield, Manchester, Baldwin. The Page Extension, Route 364, going to St. Charles, St. Peters, Wentzville, New Melly, etc. Also, you have Highway 370 passing by the Old Mills Mall, headed to St. Charles County. And of course, Highway 70 passing by the St. Louis Airport that leads to St. Charles County. So you have 4 separate highways that are going to St. Charles County westbound. Highway 40, Page Extension, Route 364, Highway 370, and Highway 70. It's during those times from 3 to 5, it's like rush hour traffic is like crazy. Bumper to bumper, white folks are racing to get out of the city of St. Louis every day. It's almost like a bomb went off in the city of despair, depression, dilapidation, after work every day for these folks. They are racing to leave St. Louis City and head to their white utopian existence in the suburbs. So let's get into this story about a forgotten history of how the U.S. government segregated America, where federal housing policies that were created after the Depression ensured that African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects such as Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Detroit's Brewster Douglas Towers in Detroit, the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, and of course Cabrini Green homes in Chicago. So in 1933, faced with a housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing stock. Author Richard Rothstein says the housing programs began under the New Deal were tantamount to a state-sponsored system of segregation. The government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white middle-class, low middle-class families. African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects. Rothstein's new book, The Color of Law, examines the local, state, and federal housing policies that mandated segregation. He noted that the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which was established in 1934, furthered the segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites, with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. And for example, in St. Louis, you had black flight, where black folks started leaving North St. Louis City and moved to North County, where many of the black families were buying from white families and buying from white builders to build homes in North County. And that's where North County has been redlined. And white folks did the white flight and moved to St. Charles County, went west. Rothstein says these decades-old housing policies have had a lasting effect on American society. The segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile when they're living in segregated neighborhoods where opportunity is absent. If we want greater equality in this society, if we want a lowering of the hostility between police and young African American men, we need to take steps to desegregate. So here's the question on how the Federal Housing Administration justified discrimination. The Federal Housing Administration's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. There was no basis for this claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, when African Americans tried to buy homes in all white neighborhoods or in mostly white neighborhoods, property values rose because African Americans were more willing to pay more for properties than whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. So the rationale that the Federal Housing Administration used was never based on any kind of study. It was never based on any reality. The term redlining comes from the development by the New Deal, by the federal government of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. And those maps were color-coded by three different organizations. The first one was the Homeowners Loan Corp, and then the Federal Housing Administration, and then it was adopted by the Veterans Administration, where they gave mortgages. And these color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. So you had three entities: the Homeowners Loan Corp, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Veterans Administration mortgage companies. And anywhere where African Americans lived nearby were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. It was in something called the underwriting manual. There was an actual manual of the Federal Housing Administration, which said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. In one development in Detroit, the FHA would not go ahead during World War II with this development unless the developer built a 6-foot high wall. Listen to this, our own government, a cement wall separating his development from a nearby African American neighborhood to make sure that no African Americans could even walk in that neighborhood. This is the underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration, which recommended that highways be a good way to separate African Americans from white neighborhoods. So this was not a matter of law. It was a matter of government regulation. But it also wasn't hidden. It can't be claimed that this was some kind of de facto situation. Regulations that are written in law and published in the underwriting manual are as much a de jure unconstitutional expression of government policy as something written in law. Today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policies implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. So the Daly City development south of San Francisco or Levittown or any of the others in between across the country, those homes in the late 1940s and 50s sold for about twice the national median income average. They were affordable to working class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000, $400,000 at a minimum, 6 to 8 times the national median income. So in 1968, we passed a Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in Daly City or Levittown, for example. But it's an empty promise because those homes are no longer affordable to the families that could have afforded them when whites were buying them into those suburbs and gaining the equity and the wealth that followed from it. These white families sent their children to college with these home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs. Public housing began in this country for civilians during the New Deal, and it was an attempt to address a housing shortage. It wasn't a welfare program for poor people. During the Depression, no housing construction was going on. Middle-class families, working-class families were losing their homes during the Depression when they became unemployed. And so there were many unemployed, middle-class, working-class white families. And this was the constituency that began the federal government to enact for suburbia, and that's what they were most interested in. And so the federal government began a program building public housing for whites only in cities across the country. The liberal instinct of some Roosevelt administration officials led them to build some projects for African Americans as well, but they were always separate projects. They were not integrated like Pruitt-Igoe was in St. Louis. Pruitt-Igoe had separate projects for whites and separate for blacks. I think Pruitt was for blacks and the Igoe was for whites, or the reverse. The white projects had large numbers of vacancies. Black projects had long waiting lists. Eventually, it became so conspicuous that the public housing authorities in the federal government opened up the white designated projects to African Americans, and they filled them with African Americans. At the same time, the industry was leaving the cities. African Americans were becoming poor in those areas, and the projects became projects for poor people, not working class people. They became subsidized when they hadn't been subsidized before. And so they became vertical slums that we became associated with public housing. So the vacancies in the white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize America. So it was the Federal Housing Administration that depopulated public housing for white families, while the public housing authorities were charged with the responsibility of housing African Americans who were increasingly too poor to pay their own rent.